Welcome back to A Localized Journey, the series where we take a long, hard look at the localization of various games across time. Last time on our little excursion through Pokemon Red, we finished up our business in Saffron City and made our way down Cycling Road. We left off just as we arrived in Fuchsia City, which is of course going to be the focus of this episode. First things first though, we have to make a quick pit stop in the Fuchsia City Pokemon Center to heal up our Pokemon, and while we're there we may as well talk with some of the townspeople to see if there are any localization changes to be seen here. Who am I kidding? We all know there are. The first guy we talk to warns us about the dangers of favoring one Pokemon over a balanced team. He says it in Japanese, if you train just one Pokemon, you can't become a strong trainer. Training many Pokemon with good balance is also difficult though. This was localized into English as, you can't win with just one strong Pokemon. It's tough, but you have to raise them evenly. The main difference in the first sentence is that the idea that you can't become a strong trainer if you train just one Pokemon was changed to you just being unable to win if you train just one Pokemon. You might think that these are pretty similar concepts, but I disagree. Why is that, you ask? Well, you don't have to be a particularly strong trainer in order to win Pokemon battles. You can be an entirely average trainer and still make it through the game just fine. We're not talking about the ability to win here, we're talking about becoming a truly strong Pokemon trainer, which in most cases means you have a varied and well-balanced team. Anyone can blast their way through Pokemon Red with one overleveled Dugtrio like I have, but I wouldn't call that becoming a strong trainer. The implications of these two sentences are completely different as a result of this change, in my opinion. As for the second sentence, well, the main difference there is that this guy conceding that training a whole team evenly is also hard to do was changed to him basically ordering you to train your team evenly. He literally says you have to raise them evenly. In my opinion, in the original Japanese, this gentleman was just trying to give you something to think about on your Pokemon journey, rather than outright declare that the only way to play the game is to train a whole team evenly. The Japanese dialogue leaves things much more open to interpretation and lets you think for yourself, unlike the English localization, which, as we've seen many times before, tries to do all the thinking for us. The next guy we talk to in the Pokemon Center says in Japanese, if you're making a Pokemon illustrated encyclopedia, you should go to the Safari Zone. I hear many rare Pokemon are being bred there. The localization of this is, if you're studying Pokemon, visit the Safari Zone. It has all sorts of rare Pokemon. As I've mentioned before, the Japanese term for Pokédex is Pokemon Zukan, which literally means Pokemon Illustrated Encyclopedia or Pokemon Field Guide. This Zukan is a very common term in Japanese that anyone would understand if you mentioned it, so it makes sense that this individual seemingly completely understands what a Pokemon Zukan would be. However, the same cannot be said for a Pokédex. Pokédex is not a common English word, in fact it's not even an English word at all. It's a combination of the words Pokemon and index, and it doesn't really immediately click as something you'd know and understand the meaning of in English. This is presumably why the idea that this person knows we're making a Pokédex was changed to him just assuming we study Pokemon. This is yet another example of the knock-on effect of localization I've mentioned before. By changing the name to Pokédex way back in the beginning of the game, you've had to adjust the dialogue here as well to make more sense with that changed name. It would be weird to have this random guy know what a Pokédex is when that's something only a select few people should know. Moral of the story, once again, is to be careful what you change because it could come back to bite you later on. Moving on to the second sentence, we see that the idea that the Safari Zone breeds Pokemon was completely removed. I'm assuming the localizer just wanted to avoid the term breed, but that is a scientific term, so it would have been fine to leave it in my opinion. Leaving the Pokemon Center now, we come across the sign for Fuchsia Gym. The Japanese version of this sign says, Fuchsia City Pokemon Gym, Leader Kyo. If it's about poison, bring on anything. The last catchphrase, if you will, is written in old-style Japanese, implying the leader of the gym has something to do with traditional Japanese culture, and in fact we'll find out later that he's a ninja. In the English, however, they just tell you straight out on the sign that he's a ninja. That sign reads, Fuchsia City Pokemon Gym, Leader Koga, the poisonous ninja master. As far as the name change goes here, it of course makes no sense to me. Koga here comes from a Japanese style of ninjutsu, so why not just leave the original name? I'll never understand the mental gymnastics required to justify changing one Japanese word to another during localization, but I guess let's just set that aside and talk about Koga's Japanese name. The name Kyo comes from the Japanese word for apricot and the associated tree. The normal reading of this word would be Anzu, which happens to be the name given to Koga's daughter Janine in Japanese. It's very easy to make the connection between these two characters in Japanese, but in English there's really no obvious through line. Janine does happen to also be a reference to ninja, but it's very hard to see that if you're not really thinking about it. Now, when it comes to the catchphrase of the gym as seen on the sign here, it's just a mess. I can maybe understand wanting to get away from the traditional Japanese language here because that doesn't translate very well into English at all, but you didn't have to dumb things down this far. Like, the only word in common between the Japanese and English is poison, and even that was changed to poisonous in English. Just off the top of my head, something like bring on the poison or I know everything about poison would have been way better. Of course, the direct translation is always best in my opinion, but for whatever reason you wanted to change things up a bit, these would have been a good compromise. Hard to believe there was this much to discuss about a few words on a sign, but that just speaks to the sheer level of localization that we see here in Pokemon Red. In a house in town, we encounter the older brother of the fishing guru, or Suri Oyaji, from back in Vermilion City. In Japanese, he says, "I'm the Suri Oyaji's older brother. I just love fishing to death. Do you like fishing? I see. It seems I'll get along well with you. I'll give you this, so you go do a ton of fishing too." This is followed by, "Ak received the good fishing rod from the Suri Oyaji." In English, this interaction goes, "I'm the fishing guru's older brother. I simply love fishing. Do you like to fish? Grand. I like your style. Take this and fish, young one." Ak received a good rod. So other than the clear removal of the reference to death, the ideas of these two conversations are relatively similar. However, when it comes to the details here, that's where things get a bit iffy. I don't know what the motivation is, and even if I did, I wouldn't agree with it, but the way this guy speaks in English is just weird. He says things like young one, grand, and I like your style. It makes him seem like a bit of a weirdo in English when that's not really the case in Japanese. He's just a normal old guy who really likes fishing. I think the idea behind the surgical injection of young one here was to make him sound like a guru, but it doesn't really work with the rest of his dialogue in my opinion, and it's also very cringe. Overall, just not a great way to localize a character's personality. Next, we come to a few signs in the center of town, the first of which reads in Japanese as, "This is Sekichiku City." Sekichiku is the brilliant pink color. In English, this sign was changed to be, "Fuchsia City. Behold, it's passion pink." As to where the behold came from, I have no idea, it's just weird. Now, when it comes to colors here, the Japanese color Sekichiku Ito comes from a flower known as Sekichiku, which is a pale pink. Fuchsia, on the other hand, comes from a different flower that has a much brighter and more vibrant hue about it. This is presumably where the idea of passion pink comes from, because the Japanese color definitely doesn't bring passion to mind whatsoever, in my opinion. To the left of this sign, we find another sign that reads in Japanese, "Tons of different Pokemon, welcome to the Safari Zone." The localization of this is Pokemon Paradise Safari Zone. This is yet another case of lost detail in the English version of the game. As I've mentioned many times thus far, thanks to the loss of detail, the English game often sounds very bland and robotic, and that is the case here as well, especially in comparison to the Japanese version of the game. Next up, we have a very interesting localization scenario in my opinion, and that is one dealing with a Japanese pun. We encounter a man named Koji waiting for a girl outside the Safari Zone, and in Japanese he says, "That's odd, I was supposed to meet Atsuko at the Pokemon Tori. I can't find any Tori Pokemon." Okay, let's break this down because that's definitely not going to make sense on its own. First of all, the front area of the Safari Zone is a zoo-like area where you can see a bunch of Pokemon, and that's where we find our friend Koji here, whose name is most likely a reference to Game Freak developer Nishino Koji, who we talked about last time. Now, as you heard, Koji said they were supposed to meet at the Pokemon Tori, and in this case that would be a reference to the back area of the Safari Zone where you catch Pokemon, and this particular Pokemon Tori would most likely be using the word Tori from toru, meaning to catch or to get in Japanese. However, if you were to reverse the Japanese words like Koji did in the latter half of the sentence, you'd get Tori Pokemon, literally meaning bird Pokemon. This is the misunderstanding on Koji's part that has led to his current predicament. Now, admittedly, this would be a very difficult piece of dialogue to localize into English, but let's see how the localizer fared here anyway. First off, the name of the speaker was changed to Eric, erasing the reference to the Game Freak developer, which is very much in poor taste in my opinion. The dialogue Eric says in English is, "Where's Sarah? I said I'd meet her here." So yeah, as expected, the pun is completely gone. Not much that could have been done, but still sad to see. Another interesting thing is that in English it seems to be Eric that set up the meeting place, but the reverse is true in Japanese. As for Sarah, or Atsuko, we'll run into her a bit later, so we can pick up the conversation about this localization then. Another fellow we run into in the front area of the Safari Zone is a young lad who seems to be a bit confused. In Japanese he says, "Did you think you'd like that item ball? Me too. That's a living creature?" The item ball he's referring to is in fact a Voltorb and not an item. He was unaware of this fact until we tell him in the Japanese, but that's not the case in English. In English, this lad says, "That item ball in there is really a Pokemon." So not only was the idea that we were the ones to tell this guy that the item ball was a living thing changed, the entire part about both of us wanting to get the item ball was completely removed. And thanks to these changes, once again we are left with a much more boring English localization. Another thing to note here is that this is yet another example of inferred main character dialogue being removed. We've seen this a number of times before, and it's definitely not a good pattern to see. Thanks to the many removals of Red's inferred dialogue in the English version of the game, many fans seem to think that Red only speaks a few times throughout the game, but that's not the case in the original Japanese. If you include the times where it's inferred that he said something, he's actually pretty talkative for a Pokemon main character. In my opinion, this omission really diminishes Red's character and just makes the game more boring in general. Now, for a change of pace, let's talk about Chansey's Japanese name, because she happens to be one of the Pokemon featured in this front zoo area. In Japanese, Chansey is known as Ducky. This is an extremely straightforward name that is just a transliteration of the English word lucky. Now, I'll admit that it would be weird to have a Pokemon just called Lucky in English, but the change to Chansey is a bit confusing in my opinion. Without any context, I would never assume that the chance in Chansey's name was meant to be chance as in game of chance. It's by no means the worst name localization we've seen, but I would still like to have seen the word luck incorporated into the name in some way. Moving inside what seems to be an official Safari Zone employee building, we find out that the employees here refer to the warden of the Safari Zone as Slowpoke because of his lazy and kind disposition. One of the employees in this building says in Japanese, Slowpoke was saying something like "funya funya." Has he gone senile? This odd way of speaking was actually due to the warden losing his dentures, but apparently this employee wasn't in the loop on that fact. The English version of this dialogue goes, "Slowpoke came in, but I couldn't understand him. I think he's got a speech problem." So clearly the English version of the game was trying very hard to avoid the idea that this employee assumes the warden has gone senile. One thing I really don't like about this change is that it removes the reference to the warden's age. In the Japanese version of the game, this "has he gone senile" line serves to set up the warden as an old man who might, I don't know, need to wear dentures because he's lost all of his teeth. In the English, however, we have no indication of how old the warden is as a result of this localization, and we even have a different explanation for why he talks in a funny way, which could potentially confuse players. Definitely not an ideal localization in any regard. Moving over to the mart in Fuchsia City, we run into a gentleman who seems to be a rather big fan of the Safari Zone. In Japanese, he says, "Isn't there a pennant that has Safari Zone written on it? What about a lantern? Are there no calendars either?" This was changed in English to be, "Do you have a Safari Zone flag? What about cards or calendars?" Let's start off here by talking about the change from lantern to cards. In Japanese, the word used for lantern is chochin, which is just your typical Japanese lantern that you'd see at a festival or outside an izakaya. It's very common for these lanterns to have writing on them of some kind, and they're even used as souvenirs in some cases. Now obviously in the West we don't have the tradition of using lanterns with writing on them, so you can see why this was changed. As to if it really needed to be changed, I'm not so sure, but I do at least understand the logic behind the change. Now to talk about the other localization here, we see that the English version has this man start out by saying, "Do you have a Safari Zone flag?" This is one way you could interpret the Japanese dialogue here, but seeing as this conversation takes place in a store, in my opinion it's more likely that this guy is actually searching for a souvenir to buy, not asking us if we have these random objects. You could say that he mistook us for a store employee and is asking if we have Safari Zone souvenirs in stock, but there's a lot of assumptions required on the part of the player there, so I definitely don't think that would be a good way to localize this conversation. Later on, just as we're about to partake in the Safari game, we find a rather odd localization. In Japanese, the receptionist who lets you into the back area of the Safari Zone says, "Would you like to play right now?" which was changed to, "Would you like to join the hunt?" in English. As we've seen many times before, this is an example of the localizer attempting to add his own flair to the dialogue, which in my opinion always ends poorly. It either makes the script way more cringy and unnatural, or it just adds nothing at all, meaning there was literally no reason to change anything to begin with. As for this individual case, I'd say it's the latter. There just really wasn't any reason to change things up here, and in the end, you didn't accomplish anything by adding your own flair, so why even bother? Next, a couple of quick things. First, we see another example of the English removing the part where we receive something specifically from someone. In this case, that would be us receiving 30 safari balls from the receptionist in Japanese. And yet another instance of removal occurs in this interaction at the very end. In Japanese, the receptionist tells us good luck, and that is completely gone from the English. Not earth-shattering, but it's still a loss of detail. When we make our way into the actual Safari game area of the Safari Zone, we quickly run into Atsuko, or Sarah as she's known in English. The name Atsuko is once again most likely a reference to a Game Freak developer, in this case Nishida Atsuko. And as far as we know, Sarah is just a random name that the localizer came up with for the English game, so that's definitely not great. Atsuko here says in Japanese, "I said let's go catch Pokemon. Koji, where are you?" So here we have a clarification on the exact phrase that Koji messed up earlier. In Japanese, Atsuko said, "Pokemon tori ni ikou," literally meaning let's go catch Pokemon. Like I said before, Koji confused this with Tori Pokemon, as in bird Pokemon, so he hasn't been able to meet up with Atsuko. Now, in my opinion, even if the interaction with Koji was based on a Japanese pun and therefore required some change, this interaction with Atsuko could have just been directly translated and been fine as a follow-up to the localization. Is that what we got here? No, not at all. The English version of Atsuko's dialogue is, "Where did my boyfriend Eric go?" Oh boy. Once again, the localizer of Pokemon Red felt inclined to completely fabricate a romantic relationship between two characters. Because as we all know, it's impossible for a guy and a girl to just be friends who like to hang out and go catch Pokemon, right? Just to be clear, there is absolutely no direct indication that these two characters are dating in Japanese. It's completely fanfiction on the part of the English localizer. But not only that, we also lost a lot of detail here as well, because in English we never get any idea from Eric or Sarah what they were planning on doing at the Safari Zone. It's just localization blunder after localization blunder with these two, and as a result we ended up with a boring couple who can't find each other for some unknown reason in the English. Now, as we all know, there are several new Pokemon to be found in the Safari Zone, and since we're going to have to go over their names at some point, we may as well go over them all at once. Let's start with one of my all-time favorite Pokemon, Scyther. In Japanese, Scyther is called Storaiku, which is literally just a transliteration of the English word strike. Next we have Tauros, whose Japanese name is Kentarosu. This name comes from Kentaurosu, a transliteration of the ancient Greek word for centaur. There's also Minotaurosu, a transliteration of the ancient Greek word for minotaur. Game Freak also seems to have taken inspiration from Ultraman yet again with Tauros, and in this case that inspiration comes from the Kentaurusu Seijin. There's a definite similarity in the eyes here, but other than that, not as much of a resemblance as we've seen in the past. We also have a chance to encounter Execute in the Safari Zone, and its Japanese name is Tamatama. This comes from the Japanese word for egg, or tamago, as well as potentially tama, meaning ball. Dratini is another Pokemon we find here, and it's known as Mini Ryu in Japanese. This name comes from Mini, a transliteration of the English word mini, meaning small, and the Japanese Ryu, meaning dragon. The second evolution of Dratini, Dragonair, is also found in the Safari Zone, and its Japanese name is Hakuryu. This name literally means white dragon in Japanese and could potentially be a reference to the white dragon from Chinese mythology. And I think that's all the Pokemon we needed to talk about when it comes to the Pokemon Red Safari Zone, so with that, let's keep on moving. A little while into my first Safari game, I find a full restore. Full restore are known as Kaifuku no Kusuri in Japanese, which just literally means recovery medicine or medicine of recovery. Now, I can understand that the localizer looked at what the full restore did and then decided to name it after the effect it had on Pokemon, but why not just stick with something closer to the original name? Even just restore or restorer would have been fine, and those are shorter than the chosen name full restore. Obviously, this isn't a huge deal, but once again, the fun of discovery has been taken away from English-speaking players with this item. The Japanese name is pretty ambiguous. It could do any number of things to your Pokemon, but in English, you pretty much know from the get-go what a full restore will do. Personally, I'll never understand changes like this. Further in, we discover the TM for Skull Bash, and yet again this is a localized name for a move. In Japanese, Skull Bash is known as Roketto Zutsuki, or just literally Rocket Headbutt. As we all know by now, I'm not a fan of changing English words used in Japanese to other English words during localization, and in my opinion in this case the English word that was changed was the most important part of the name. The rocket part of Rocket Headbutt makes it unique and interesting, so at the very least that part should have been left intact. Something like Skull Rocket or Rocket Skull would have done the job and kept the original intention of the name mostly unaltered. In a rest house deeper in the Safari Zone, we find a guy who tells us about a campaign going on in the Safari Zone. In Japanese, he says, "You know how there's a campaign going on right now? Apparently they give you a prize at the shack in the deepest part of the zone." This was localized to, "Go to the deepest part of the Safari Zone. You will win a prize." So essentially what they've done here is completely remove the first sentence and then split the second sentence into two separate sentences for no reason. The biggest loss in this case is the loss of the idea that there is a special campaign going on right now that allows you to get the prize at the end of the Safari Zone. We will see it mentioned later when we get said prize if memory serves me correctly, but even still, not having any idea about this being a limited time event prior to actually getting the prize seems pretty counterintuitive to me. This change does nothing but take away from the detail of the Safari Zone as a whole, which as a result diminishes the player experience. In a different rest house later on, we find another individual who tells us the Japanese names for Flareon and Vaporeon. Flareon is known as Boosta, and Vaporeon is known as Shawazu. If you know your katakana, you'll know these names are transliterations of the English words booster and showers, respectively. Personally, in this case, I don't think these names needed to be changed at all. The Japanese names were unique enough, despite being English words, that they wouldn't sound weird in English, so why not just leave them alone? Also, if you haven't noticed, the Japanese names for the evolutions aren't nearly as uniform as the English localizations. This is a trend that started in Generation 1 and would continue for the rest of the series thanks to this one single localization choice. There are some Japanese names for the evolutions that are uniform, but there are also those that aren't, like Booster here. Pokemon like that have had their individuality removed just because the localizer felt like it. Not great. Near the last house in the Safari Zone, we find yet another TM, this time for Double Team. In Japanese, Double Team is called Kagebunshin, which literally means shadow clone. Kagebunshin, or Ninpo Kagebunshin no Jutsu, is a very common technique used by ninja in all forms of Japanese media. The most popular portrayal of this technique in the West would undoubtedly be Naruto, but that wasn't the first, nor was it the last. Now, as to whether this name warranted a change, personally I don't think it did. Just a direct translation to Shadow Clone or Shadow Clones would have been a fine name for a move in English that everyone would understand. In fact, I even think it would make more sense than the chosen name Double Team. Typically, when we think of the term double team in English, we think of two people ganging up on one person, but that's not what the move does. I mean, it's not even an offensive move, it just raises your evasion, so what does that have to do with double team? If you really think about it, this was a really poor name choice for the move that it is. Now for the last part of this episode, I'd like to talk about a few things that came up during the conversation with the Safari Zone employee in the secret house. And the first thing I like to mention is just that, the so-called secret house. In Japanese, this house is known as the treasure house. The name secret house was one chosen by the localizer, and in my opinion, it doesn't even make any sense. The whole point of this house being here is that it's a goal for people playing the Safari game. If you didn't know where the goal was, or even if there was a goal, then it wouldn't be a goal. We're told about this secret house several times by various NPCs, so in that respect as well, it's not a secret. The name treasure house makes much more sense here. Next, we receive the HM for Surf, and once again in English we just receive it, while in Japanese it's stated who we receive it from, in this case the attendant. The name of Surf itself is also a localization coming from the Japanese Nami Nori, meaning wave ride. Now of course wave ride could be interpreted as meaning surf, but Japanese typically uses the transliteration of surfing or safin to refer to the sport, so I'm not sure I would have gone with surf in this case. But other than those few things, this interaction is actually localized pretty well, which is a nice change of pace. And with that, we've come to the end of yet another episode of a localized journey through Pokemon Red. Next time we'll tackle the Fuchsia City Gym and probably start to make some progress towards Cinnabar Island, so definitely look forward to that. Also, as usual, if you happen to enjoy today's episode, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks as always for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Back out.